Good morning, metalheads of the internet, and welcome to a new episode of the Metal Meltdown. Just a quick reminder before we get started, if you want to learn even more about this particular album from this particular band, then all you've got to do is check out the link in the description of this video, which will direct you to a very, very special and exclusive interview I conducted with Whitechapel's longtime guitarist, Ben Savage. Booyah! That is all. Now let's talk about this brand new studio album from Whitechapel entitled Kin. Kin is the 8th studio album from American deathcore crew Whitechapel and a direct sequel to their previous studio album, The Valley. While Whitechapel had already been quietly and subtly experimenting with different types of melodies and metallic grooves on records like Our Endless War and Mark of the Blade, The Valley saw Whitechapel fundamentally change how they wrote and recorded music. It was much more emotive, it was much more lush, it was much more provocative and intense and intimate. There were a lot of melodic hooks, a lot of clean vocals, a lot of acoustic guitar passages, and in general, the album was less of a deathcore record and more of a hodgepodge of alternative metal and melodic death metal with some progressive flourishes. But what really made The Valley so fundamentally different from previous Whitechapel releases, and in turn what made The Valley so special and so powerful for so many people, was how much more emotionally vulnerable and transparent Whitechapel were on that album, and in particular, lead singer and songwriter Phil Bozeman. His lyrics were very dark and intense and deeply revealing and introspective as he reflected on his relationship with his mother, his father, his experiences growing up in Knoxville, Tennessee. It really did feel as if we were peering into his mind, as if this was some kind of group therapy session, and here I am on the couch patting Phil's back going, "It's gonna be okay, buddy. We'll figure it out, I promise." Some fans were not super keen or receptive to these changes, and to an extent I can understand why. If you're just looking for a bunch of fucking nasty grooves, some meat and potatoes deathcore, then I don't see why something as revealing and progressive as The Valley would appeal to you at all. But thankfully, Whitechapel, unlike so many other deathcore bands who have attempted to go into more revealing and progressive territory only to be torn apart by their fan base, cough cough suicide silence, have not chickened the fuck out with Kin. They have stuck to their guns, or perhaps in this case their box of Kleenex, and they have expanded upon everything that made The Valley so important and so special and so powerful. Conceptually and emotionally, this album picks up directly where the previous album, The Valley, ended. Whereas Doom Woods instilled you with a real sense of, well, doom, I Will Find You instills you with a sense of hope, of light. Like, maybe there's a chance that this won't be just a miserable, horrid affair. As such, it's actually a pretty triumphant and declarative number, with some ripping melodic death metal flavors akin to that of At the Gates, but with a deathcore kind of presence and underbelly. And impressively, even as this track transitions into a more somber and melodic kind of hook akin to something I'd hear from A Perfect Circle or Stone Sour, this track doesn't lose any of its urgency or momentum. It adds some bittersweet and much-needed contrast to this track, which is then emboldened by a ripping classic rock-style guitar solo. You can feel the fucking blood, sweat, and tears flying off the fucking guitar strings with this one. My god, what a fantastic, soulful guitar solo. I'm not the type to nerd out over guitar solos, because frankly, I normally don't give a fuck, but goddamn, that is one tasty fucking lick. Following track, The Lost Boy, is a little bit more stubborn in some aspects, a little bit more abrasive, but still weirdly very technical. Like, I can't help but be reminded of, like, Sun Eater era Job for a Cowboy and some of the At the Gate style melodeath flavors of the previous cut. Truth be told, I wasn't a huge fan of this track when it was initially released as a promo single a few months ago, but it's grown on me a lot. In context of the full album, I think it's actually a pretty powerful and effective number. Same goes for A Blood-Soaked Symphony, which has perhaps some of the nastiest, crunchiest grooves I've heard out of Whitechapel in a while. Anyone worried that Whitechapel has gone soft, that they've lost their edge in any way whatsoever, is gonna love the shit out of this track. It almost borders on the blackened death metal beatdowns that I would expect from like some late 2000s behemoth, contrasted with some seriously disgusting deathcore grooves and breakdowns. Similarly, tracks like the ones that made us and To the Wolves offer some classic deathcore flavors that longtime fans will absolutely appreciate. Personally, I prefer a Blood-Soaked Symphony. I just think it's a lot heavier and a lot more unique, but hey, I can still get down with these numbers. Truth be told, though, as divisive as the progressive and melodic flavors of the modern Whitechapel sound may be, I still think that these are among the most potent and pungent. At least, it's these tracks that are resonating with me the most. I mean, sure, tracks like Anti-Cure and History is Silent maybe lyrically and musically aren't really doing anything that different from anything we heard on the Valley, and sure, I guess they're not really even all that better, all things considered, but they're still pretty effective. Even something like The Orphan, which opts for a very straightforward kind of post-grunge alt-metal ballad formula. I can't help but just really feel for Phil on this track. Yes, it's a little derivative, but not necessarily incompetent, and especially not ineffective. Particularly not on the album's closing cut and title track, Kin, which starts off on a pretty straightforward kind of 90s rock, emo, post-grunge acoustic drawl, before transforming into a pretty lush kind of old-school hard rock power ballad. Look, I ultimately don't really know how a lot of people are going to respond to this. I feel like this could be a very, very, very divisive record, more so than The Valley, and if that's the case, so be it. But here's what I know. I really like this album. I really like seeing Whitechapel continue to indulge in their love of classic rock and alternative rock and melodic death metal, continuing to write more personal and progressive music as opposed to just recycling the same ham-fisted deathcore beatdowns and grooves over and over and over again. No, it's not as provocative or as inventive or as impactful as The Valley, but there's really no way it was going to be. That was just such a shocking album. It truly was a lightning in a bottle kind of moment for Whitechapel. But to the band's credit, they really fucking tried. They didn't settle for rinsing and repeating everything that made The Valley great, nor do they settle for just going back to making boring, typical, generic deathcore. They tried to expand the story, they tried to bring in new influences, and I think for the most part, it worked. No, they didn't recapture lightning in a bottle, but lightning definitely at some point grazed the bottle. So you know what? Fuck it. I'm giving this a 4 out of 5. I think it's a fucking great album. Thoroughly entertaining from start to finish. There's not a single moment, a single song, a single bit of anything that I would cut from this album. The production is fantastic. Everything is so clean and crisp. It's heavy when it needs to be, but very soft and lush and warm when it needs to be. I think it's very safe to say that if you didn't like The Valley and you were hoping that Whitechapel would return to a more typical deathcore sound, then you probably won't like this album. But even so, I don't know, Blood-Soaked Symphony is pretty fucking heavy. Sounds pretty fucking brutal to me, at least. I'm very curious to see how and if Whitechapel expands upon this story and expands upon these influences in the future. I'm curious to see how people respond to this album. As I said, I think it will be a pretty divisive album. Even amongst some of my fellow metal YouTubers, there seems to be a bit of a disagreement on where this record stands, a bit of a mixed response. I won't spoil anything, but let's just say I think I know what Metal Trenches is going to say in his upcoming review. I don't know. I don't care, though. I genuinely thought this was a great album. 4 out of 5. I don't fucking care. It's fucking great. Check it out. Fucking honestly. And that is it for the Metal Meltdown. I'm not an expert, nor do I claim to be, so what do you think? Do you like this record? Do you not like this record? And what do you want to hear from me next? And thank you for watching. Make sure you press subscribe right here so you get updates on the Metal Meltdown fucking immediately. And as always, you have yourself a fantastic fucking day.